This is not a DJI Mini 2. This is a drone from a company called Potensic. There's a lot of good and bad things to be said here. Is this really a valid successor to the DJI Mini 2? With this Fly More package, you're going to be greeted with the drone itself with the updated gimbal design, really high quality plastic gimbal cover, a battery charger that allows you to charge all 3 batteries at once, an improvement over DJI, as well as 3 different batteries. You'll also be receiving the charger itself for the batteries, and also the controller and a bunch of cables. Specifically, this package also comes with a bunch of extra propellers, so that way if you kind of crash this or damage those, you can use those as well. You'll also be given a screwdriver with a bunch of new screws, so that way you can also replace those as needed. So this looks nearly identical to a DJI Mini 2, and also very similar to the previous versions, almost the same airframe. However, the internal structure has definitely clearly changed, and the boards also do look different. Previously, they did not have a gimbal, and this was done all through electronic image stabilization. And the biggest complaint I believe with that one was just that it didn't have a gimbal. And while that's cool for some shots, it wasn't actually executed the best so that you could fly around and get some cool FPV shots. Instead, it just was very jerky. So the Potensic drone now has a stabilized gimbal, and the image quality coming out of this really hasn't changed much. It's still the same thing, only now really the image sensor is just put on a gimbal, which is good. However, it's kind of creeped up into an interesting market. It's competing with a lot of other different products around the same price. For example, the DJI Mini 2 SE now with its 2.7K recording versus this, which has that 4K 30 FPS recording, is interesting because the DJI Mini 2 is slightly less, but this Fly More package that comes with, the batteries and all the fancy stuff is going to be priced around $400 with the Mini 4 SE Fly More package being around $450, $460. DJI has conveniently priced everything to make you always question your buying decisions. So if you really wanted to go up even higher, you could get a Mini 3. And for the sake of today's video, I don't actually have a Mini 3, I have a Mini 3 Pro, and that's not particularly an apples to apples comparison. However, the camera is. So minus the features of obstacle avoidance, and still ultimately is the same camera in terms of this video. Almost all DJI drones now come with some form of log recording. That means that you can start color grading things and get some very stunning images. If you're lacking any of that functionality on this, maybe considering getting some type of DJI drone to get the color correction. Maybe you're looking into photogrammetry. This is not compatible with any photogrammetry software. So that means that if you're using this in any commercial capacity, you want to learn some of these new skills that are some of the highest paying in the drone industry, you're not really able to actually take advantage of that. So if you're ever considering doing anything commercial, about half the pilots that I talk to nowadays have their Part 107 just so in case the occasion arises. Now this is kind of getting a little bit more serious. It is questionable why we don't just bother with putting the gyro data on there. It's not terribly difficult in any capacity. One of my biggest concerns with the original Atom, the Atom SE, was that the low light image quality was unbearably bad. Now, I've noticed that with this new camera assembly, when you start taking pictures, there is some very clear distortion around the edges, and I wonder if that's more of a focusing issue or if it's just, how the gimbal's set up, because I don't remember really encountering that issue too much with the Atom SE, that the image was relatively clear throughout, but with the Atom, I'm really encountering some blurring around the edges, and it really means that the only thing that's really high detail, and high detail is relative here, is going to be the stuff that's in the center of the frame. I was able to work with Potensic a little bit to actually get a different set of firmware that actually is supposed to help with some of this ISO issues. I've noticed that a lot of the blurriness around the corners is specifically attributed to high ISO. And I've noticed specifically, especially in like those dark situations. So I think that might just be some of the noise cancellation or some of the noise reduction software in there. However, I did notice that with this new update, better white balance / ISO, I've noticed that the picture quality, while it is not all the way fixed, it is a substantial step up in terms of actually how usable the photos become. My advice would be that if your photos are coming out blurry, to just kind of manually deal with the ISO and try to kind of set that to a known value. Yes, you may get some photos that are dark, and I personally think that this drone probably allows you to have an ISO that is higher than it should, because it really starts getting to 720p photos really quickly when it starts getting dark if you let the ISO kind of automatically go in certain circumstances. However, I think that auto white balance still has a little bit to go. There is some issues occasionally still. However, again, I think it's an improvement. Another thing that I'd like to talk about though is just a personal suggestion and something else to be aware of. When you fly this drone, specifically when you're flying it under trees, you'll notice that sometimes it will get a satellite lock. Once it gets a satellite lock, it will move a lot faster. However, if it stops getting that satellite lock, it gets some bounce, one of the satellite signals bounces off something and kind of messes up where it thinks it is, it will kind of start slowing down and use the optical flow. Also, not a particularly bad thing. I prefer that. It does occasionally when it kind of flies forward and has that happen, it starts moving a lot. Specifically, if you like to fly it forward and you get into a spot that does lose that satellite lock, it very quickly drifts off. I think there could be a little bit of software added in there to kind of keep it in the same position. But the other thing that kind of bothers me a little bit is in situations in the reverse of that, where you're flying underneath the trees, the drone's using the optical flow, and then all of a sudden it gets the satellite lock, and instead of just kind of casually, slowly speeding up, it just all of a sudden is full throttle again. I think the value proposition here is pretty interesting because you're looking at something where for a full kit, you're looking at something that is going to have like $400 versus if you were to get the DJI Mini 2 SE, you're looking at $450, $460 for the same kit. Now keep in mind this records at a higher resolution of 4K 30 versus the Mini's 2.7K 30 FPS, and the quality on this is going to be better than that. I think the only nearest thing that you could buy in terms of this would be like the Mini 3, and to get something that's fully set out with the same level of batteries, etc., you're looking at like $650. So it really is a $250 gap between this and the Mini 3. Now, if you want to get something like the Mini 2 SE, because the photogrammetry software is important to you, if you want to create models, or the log recording is important, that's something to consider. The picture quality on this is decent. I think given the price range, it does compete relatively nicely. And there is a night and day difference between what you're going to get on this drone with picture quality and what you're going to get on a Mini 3, especially with the ability to have the larger flight times with the battery. There is some things to be asked, really, whether or not you want a full kit for $400 or you want just the drone and a battery for $460, but the image quality being substantially better in that regard. Now, I would like to point out that the build quality on all this is phenomenal. I would say this is easily on par with DJI. There is no question about any of the cheapness feel that you would normally get with some of these sub $400 drones. There are a lot of drones around this area, Ruko, Holystone. These guys, their drones just don't fly and behave and feel proper. And you also have the ability for, of course, this remote that has that direct connection to your phone. So it does transmit directly through your phone. And all of this feels relatively high quality. That has been an issue that I've noticed, especially with some of these cheaper drone manufacturers. So this is, I would say, no different in terms of quality. And in terms of flight performance, there's a little bit to be desired there. I noticed that in some certain circumstances, the drone's range really did take a detriment. The image quality did drop out a bit, and that was something to be had there. It was interesting that how quickly it did drop out. It was probably only maybe about 400 meters, 500 meters. And if you obfuscated the controller behind some type of solid object, you would definitely notice pretty quickly that the image started jittering and losing some quality. It is not on par with maybe DJI in terms of their distance. However, I've definitely noticed that, I mean, you've got to keep eyesight on the drone, right? So there's only so much you really can do in terms of distance. So I don't find that as major of an issue, but I did find that it was within the range I would say that you could fly a drone normally, be doing something decently far away, still have eye contact on the drone, and struggle with visual quality on your device. The wind resistance on this I also noticed was kind of interesting. I flew this in a rather windy day with a lot of the tree movement, a lot of low altitude winds, and it was very interesting to see the drone bobbing around very quickly, and this was with a relatively solid satellite lock. So it was interesting to see just how crazy this behaves, and I would say it also can wander from about 1 meter to 1.5 meters up to 2 meters away from its original point in space. Again, for something that doesn't have obstacle avoidance, it is something to definitely consider. I think the video quality also showcases the dynamic range issues, especially with the auto ISO and auto white balance. The dynamic range and all that stuff can really be seen how finicky it is when you take a video and how quickly it changes. I found that it really is kind of jarring how much the image can change, especially in terms of color, when you change different scenes from maybe something that's well lit to something that's not. There is one feature though that DJI's mini drones do not, at least the Mini 2 SE and Mini 2. This does feature visual image tracking. I'm not sure if it's done on the drone or on the device, but that allows you, instead of being GPS based, to be using it based off of the drone itself. The tracking again is questionable given that choice of doing that with a drone that doesn't have obstacle avoidance, but I'll be interested to see what the iterations of this are going forward. There's a couple of clips of me just walking around trying different things with the tracking, and as you can see, you can make the judgment of what you prefer. The user interface is very similar to what we saw with the Atom. It's very similar in terms of same remote, same kind of app. And honestly, I am actually a big fan of this kind of style of app. I prefer to have the phone in the center and not wonky up top. And this actually does make for a reasonably usable flying experience. There is no way to either store the cable internally like you would see on, say, something that came with the Mavic, DJI RC N1 or N2 controllers. So this is very much still I would have liked some type of wire to get in there and wrap around some way to store it, but it isn't terribly bad as well. The joysticks are controlled here, and it is at least a decent controller that has decent battery life. Speaking of battery life, I actually did see about 30 minutes of battery life. The controller lasts maybe like 7 or 8 flights worth of battery time, and also the gimbal version is slightly heavier, so it seems that there was a trade-off for a higher end battery without really compromising flight time. And finally, the camera stabilization versus the Atom SE. It really was a substantial step up in terms of the stabilization. Now that you actually have a physical gimbal that's manually stabilizing things, there is definitely a step up in terms of the quality of that stabilization. And I'd be curious to know if they have any type of electronic image stabilization, IES, that actually does work on this as well, because I feel like that might be contributing to some of this blurriness that we're seeing on the edges of the image. I'd like to thank you very much for watching. Check out the channel for other cool tech-related news, reviews, and videos, and I hope to see you around next time. Goodbye.